Hello, and welcome to Section 2, Lecture 5 of the Marlborough Medieval Studies course. This is on the Avignon papacy, the Great Schism, and a couple of Proto-Reformation thinkers, people leading up to the Reformation itself, notably John Hus and John Wycliffe. The way to think about this section generally as covering something like the 14th and 15th centuries is that after the real explosion of differing ways of religious expression in the 12th and 13th centuries, the 14th and 15th centuries really represent a series of crises for the Catholic Church. Now, not everything they go through is a crisis, and there are definitely times when it doesn't look like these will be the end of Catholic unity. And there's also the question of whether or not they still had Catholic unity, because, of course, back in the 11th century, they had the schism with the Eastern Church. So in some sense, Catholicism had already lost its claim to representing all Christians. But as you'll see from some of these texts, they don't give up on that so easily. So the first of these events, the first two of these are really connected. The Avignon papacy, which is also referred to sometimes as the Babylonian captivity, and then the Great Schism, which results at the end of the Avignon papacy. There are for a while two popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome, and the resolution of that schism and the problems that it causes to have two popes for a number of years creates a number of different new theological thoughts and responses, and a lot of debate going on in Europe about how the Catholic Church should be structured, what the Catholic Church actually represents, what is the value of the Pope, what strengths does the Pope actually have. So the first of these, to start with the Avignon papacy in a way is the last episode in the investiture controversy. And you can go and listen to the whole investiture controversy discussion if you want, but if you remember, it basically boils down to who has the power, kings or the Pope, to appoint bishops, to create church leaders, and ultimately, what is the separation of powers between the church and the state? So in 1300, this comes down to the last conflict is between King Philip of France, Philip the Fair, and Pope Boniface VIII. Now, in 1301, Philip the Fair accuses a bishop of Pamiers of treason against the crown. And the Pope responds by defending his bishop, saying that bishops cannot be tried by the king, they have to be kept within the church, he is under the power of the church, and the king cannot supersede his authority by attacking bishops directly. Now, Philip might have been willing to compromise. He was having troubles in Flanders at this point and is fighting a number of different battles on a number of different fronts, and he probably didn't need a big headache about this bishop. But before a compromise is reached, the Pope reacts very, very harshly and really hardens his attitude. And in some ways, you see him going back to claims made in the investiture controversy that popes haven't been able to sustain for years. But he issues a papal bull in November 18, 1302, called Unam Sanctam. And in it, he gives one of the most full-throated defenses of papal power over just about anything that we've seen in several hundred years. And I'm going to read a chunk of this just so you get a sense of the language. It reads, "Therefore, of the one and only church there is one body and one head, not two heads like a monster. That is, Christ and the vicar of Christ, Peter and the successor of Peter. Since the Lord speaking to Peter himself said, 'Feed my sheep,' meaning my sheep in general, not these nor those in particular, whence we understand that he entrusted all to him, to Peter. Therefore, if the Greeks or others should say that they are not confided to Peter and to his successors, they must confess not being the sheep of Christ." And you notice this comment on the Greeks. They might also still be thinking of the schism of the 11th century, saying, they are also not beholden enough to the Pope. Since our Lord says in John, there is one sheepfold and one shepherd, we are informed by the texts of the Gospels that in this church and in its power are two swords, namely the spiritual and the temporal. And this two swords argument is something that we've seen in the investiture controversy, this split between what kings have the right to do and what popes have the right to do. For when the apostles say, "Behold, here are two swords," that is to say, in the church, since the apostles were speaking, The Lord did not reply that there were too many, but sufficient. Certainly the one who denies that the temporal sword is in the power of Peter has not listened well to the word of the Lord, commanding, "Put up thy sword into thy scabbard." Both, therefore, are in the power of the church, that is to say, the spiritual and the material sword. But the former is to be administered for the church, but the latter by the church. The former in the hands of the priest, the latter by the hands of kings and soldiers, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. One sword ought to be subordinate to the other, and temporal authority subjected to spiritual power. So, clearly a full-throated defense of the spiritual power, the priest here being the Pope, who has control over what kings do and how kings exercise the material sword, meaning they can influence who kings appoint, presumably what wars kings fight, how kings run their countries. Now, King Philip doesn't like this, obviously, and in this huge overreach, he responds by drawing up a list of charges against the Pope and attempting to arrest him. He actually sends French knights to arrest the Pope. This leads to what is sometimes referred to as the outrage at Agnani, where they go in to arrest him. Purportedly, one of the knights slaps Pope Boniface, which is considered just beyond the pale. The Pope leaves, but he actually dies of a stroke a little while later. Maybe the being roughed up by the French knights really got to him, and he blew a gasket, basically. At any rate, he dies very shortly after this, and so there's no immediate resolution to the problem. Philip the Fair then turns around and tries to have a Frenchman elected as Pope by the College of Cardinals. And the College of Cardinals is split between Italian and French popes. Now, they eventually go with a French person who is not in the College of Cardinals. Ramon Bertrand de Got is elected as Pope Clement V in 1305. And this is after substantial negotiations. They take almost a year to come to a place where they're going to meet and to balance out the needs of the French king, or the demands of the French king, with what they see as the needs of the papacy. Now, initially, it seems like Clement V is a compromise position that the Italians can agree with, but very quickly it becomes clear that he really is in the pocket of the French king. He immediately appoints a number of French cardinals, weighting the College of Cardinals more towards the French side. And as soon as it becomes clear that he has some power to act to consolidate his reign without the interference of the Pope, Philip the Fair, who is a big proponent of theological kingship, he really sees himself as a defender of Christ on earth. He sees himself as a divine representative, in a way, of the French people, and that he is the defender of France and the defender of Christendom within France. And he uses this theological justification to really centralize his power. So Clement V is elected in 1305. In 1306, they round up and arrest almost 100,000 Jews. They kick out a bunch of other Jews from the kingdom. In 1307, they start rounding up and arresting the Templars, who are also wealthy and somewhat independent from the French power. So they're people who are like the Jews, who are not directly controlled by the king. So he's removing systematically any power bases that might go against him. He actually asks Clement V to declare the Templars heretical. Clement V won't do it initially. This is one of the few points where they disagree. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay of the Templars is in prison, but Clement V says that he needs a council to do this. So he calls the Council of Vienne in 1311, 1312. The council also doesn't really declare them heretics. They stop short of declaring it a heretical organization. But they have confessions of heresy and of other evil sins from Jacques de Molay. But he recants, saying that those were given under torture, and Pope Clement himself basically gives the green light and issues a number of bulls. Despite the council being a little bit reticent, he says, no, go ahead, we're going to dissolve the organization. He issues an order for the organization to be formally dissolved as something recognized by the Pope. And Philip the Fair has Jacques de Molay, along with some of the other major leaders, declared heretics and burns them at the stake. in 1314. And one of the legends to come out of this, now the Templars are, of course, sources of tons and tons of legends, and many of them are not true. One of the legends about this that has some documentation is that in the flames, Jacques de Molay curses the French king and the Pope and says that their punishments will come upon them also. And within just a month, the Pope has died of an illness, and within the year, Philip the Fair has died in a hunting accident, and Philip the Fair's sons, over the next about 15 years, rapidly inherit and then die on the French throne until the Capetian house actually has no direct heirs. And this is one of the major sources of the 100 Years' War, is this rapid death of all of the French kings, not having anybody to inherit, which leads to an inheritance war with England, which is the core of what that's about. There's a whole lecture about it if you're interested. We don't know. Okay, the legend is about the curse and it being the curse that leads to all these deaths. Obviously, there's no proof for that. But it is clear that both Philip and Clement are dead quite shortly after their destruction of the Templars and the burning of the Grand Master at the stake. It leads to a good story. Now, the other thing that Clement V does that is really key for the rest of the century and for the Great Schism is that he moves the location of the papal curia. Initially, he moves it to not within France, but to a district just outside of Avignon that is actually under control of the Normans. As we talked about a little bit, this whole area of southern France is not directly France yet. It's owned by a number of different principalities. It will become France eventually, and France has a greater and greater interest in what goes on in the region. But it's most notable that it has moved out of Italy and out of Rome. And it turns out that it will stay in Avignon for almost 70 years at this point. This makes a big deal for who gets elected in the future. The College of Cardinals, now tipped towards the French side, will continue to elect French cardinals for almost the entire Avignon papacy. It also is a signal in some ways, it becomes a symbol of the subservience of the Pope to the French king and the real final loss in the investiture controversy for the papacy. The initial reason given by Clement for leaving Rome is that it's not safe. There's a growing number of militias, and the local nobility in Rome are pretty restless and cause all sorts of problems and havoc. One of them actually burns down one of the major papal churches, or it doesn't burn it all the way down, but it's not a safe church to use after the fire. So they say, well, it's just not safe in Rome, so we're moving to this other place. It's only temporary. Turns out not to be temporary. 70 years, as I said, just shy of 70 years. And by the end of that time, much of Europe is fed up with it. Catherine of Siena writes a number of letters trying to get the popes to return. Petrarch refers to it as the Babylonian captivity, as if the Jews have been marched out of Jerusalem to Babylon and are not where they are properly supposed to be praying. John Wycliffe in England refers to it in front of the English Parliament. He refers to it as a nest of simony and that sinful city. So you see a lot of the major thinkers of the day really beginning to attack the fact that the papacy is not in Rome, and it becomes a sticking point in papal relationships with all of Christianity. So this sets the stage then for the Great Schism, which is one of these events that really literally divides Christendom, divides lots of opinions, leads to new theological thinking, some fairly radical thoughts, and in some ways helps set the stage for what will eventually be the Reformation. And we see lots of important figures writing in this time period, looking at how the Pope holds power and beginning to question what that means and new ways to go about it. And I'll come to some of the thoughts surrounding this in just a second. We will start with the events that actually bring about what is referred to as the Great Schism. So first, Gregory XI is elected in 1370, and under this increasing pressure, there are a lot of letters to him from people all over, but Catherine of Siena is one of the more famous writers, as I mentioned. Under this pressure, he finally decides in 1376 that he's going to return the papal curia to Rome. The violence has died down a little bit. It's a little safer. And so he travels back to Rome, great procession, great acclaim. Everybody's very happy about this. Oh, you can see here the image of Catherine of Siena greeting Gregory the 11th as he proudly returns to Rome, and you can see the procession behind him. This is an image, a commemoration in a sense of that event. And then, unfortunately, he's only there for 2 years, and he dies in 1378. And there are riots as the College of Cardinals meet, and they are forcing the College of Cardinals to elect a Roman. There's major pressure to have things go back to the way that they were. They want a Roman elected. They want the Curia to be in Rome. The College of Cardinals, under pressure from the mob, very quickly elects a Neapolitan. Again, it's a little like the election of Clement V. The Neapolitan is seen, he's not a Roman, but he's certainly not French, and it doesn't seem like there's a threat that he's going to go back to Avignon, so they're trying to pick a middle candidate, but it's done under duress. This is Urban VI. Urban VI is in power from 1378 to 1389. Now, since this is all done under the pressure from the mob, the cardinals very quickly flee to Agnani. And if you remember, they're retracing their steps, right? This is where Clement V was arrested by the French knights. But in Anagni, they elect a second pope, Clement VII, in 1378. So now there are two popes, Clement VII and Urban VI. Clement VII goes back to Avignon, while Urban VI stays in Rome. And you see their time in office overlaps. So there's 10 years now where there are popes in both places. And this two-pope situation is going to continue. They both put together a college of cardinals. Some of the original cardinals give their allegiance to one or the other pope. So there are two competing colleges and two competing curias and two competing popes. And so you have a schism. And this goes on for a while, right? Urban VI in Rome is succeeded by Boniface IX, who is succeeded by Gregory XII. Clement VII is succeeded by Benedict XIII. And finally, after 30 years of this, much of Christendom is starting to get sick of it. There are a lot of bishops who are frustrated by this situation, right? Who do you give your allegiance to? You don't want to give your allegiance to the wrong person. Maybe you don't have a strong opinion about which one you like better. But you're a bishop and you are supposed to deal with the papal court, right? There are legal issues to determine. There are questions of religious dogma and who is issuing what bull, what orders do you pay attention to. So it's a massive problem for pretty much everybody in the Christian hierarchy in Europe. And after 30 years of this, people are getting really both nervous and pretty fed up. So in that time period, you start getting all sorts of new theological comments and nervousness. Some of the most prominent are Peter d'Ailly in Paris and Jean Gerson also, who begin to formulate a theology that is known as Conciliarism. And this is perhaps the most important thing to come out of the Great Schism. There are other consequences of it, one of which we'll talk about in a minute, how it pertains to the Reformation, but conciliarism is certainly one of the more important aspects to come out of it. In response to there being two popes and an inability to pick between them, there are two duly elected popes by the same College of Cardinals. The College of Cardinals then splits. You have two colleges of cardinals, both of which seem authoritative, electing popes that seem authoritative. So how do you get out of that situation when neither pope will give? And what these theologians, Peter d'Ailly and Jean Gerson, and as I said, others ascribe to and begin to formulate is that perhaps church councils are the place where real church doctrine should be formulated, and that the statements of councils are more important than the statements of popes. Now, there's some precedent for that, right? The Council of Nicaea is where the Nicene Creed, the doctrine of the Trinity, where some of the major facets of Christian theology are laid out. And that's not done by a pope, it's done by a council and a group of different leaders from around Christendom. There are other, the Fourth Lateran Council, and the Fourth Lateran Council is very much under the direction of a pope and has been called by a pope, but makes statements that are not simply papal edicts. So there's some authority and precedent for the authority of councils and the power that they can hold. The problem at this point in time is that councils, at least for the past few hundred years, and Lateran IV is a good example of this, councils are things that are called by the Pope to determine questions. Now, if there are two popes and they call competing councils and the councils come up with competing ideas, what do, right? You have the same problem of a split curia. So there are efforts put into place to try to create an ecumenical council that is everybody that can find a way out of this impasse. And they actually get Pope Benedict and Gregory XII to meet in Pisa in 1409. And they try to say, okay, we're going to have a council, we're going to elect a new pope, and both of you are going to step down. Now, it turns out that both of them back out. And so the council at Pisa rejects them both and elects a third, Alexander V. You can see this down in the bottom right list. These are the third pope. So now we have three competing popes. Alexander V is only alive for about a year and a half. He dies, but that council then gets back together and elects a new pope, John the 23rd, from 1410 to 1415. So for these 6 years, there are three popes. There's this itinerant pope that the council at Pisa had originally put into place and that has the support of the Conciliarists. There is the papal curia in Avignon and the papal curia in Rome. So obviously things are going from bad to worse. So what John the 23rd does, because his backing and his existence as pope is part of this conciliarist idea, or at least owes some backing to them, he calls the Council of Constance. And he's under a lot of pressure to do this. It's not clear that he totally wants to, but people are pushing him to. And as I said, his backing is from exactly the group of people who want a council to get together and solve this problem. So the council is a long one. It runs from 1414 to 1418. It's 4 years. In 1415, they convince Gregory XII to resign. And John the 23rd also at this point agrees to resign. So two of the popes now say, yes, I will recognize this ecumenical council. Of course, John the 23rd is one of the ones who called the ecumenical council. They both agree to resign. That gets us down to one pope, and Pope Benedict XIII is then declared an anti-pope by the council. They say, no, we will no longer recognize your papacy. We will create a new pope. And in 1417, they finally elect Martin V. Now, you'll notice that Benedict XIII has his 1417 in parentheses. That's because 1417 is when he is declared by the council to no longer be pope. He actually flees to Aragon in Spain and continues to declare himself pope until 1423, and he actually formulates a little mini college of cardinals. And this actually continues for a few decades. They're down to like 3 cardinals, and the 3 cardinals pick one of the 3 of them to be pope. So there's this guy in Spain claiming to be pope decades after this is solved. And, by the end of it, nobody's paying any attention. Now, part of what helps really resolve this crisis is that Martin himself, once he is made pope in 1417 at the Council of Constance, he has a long papacy. And you remember we talked about this with rulers, that consolidation of territory and reign is really assisted by rulers who have a long shelf life. If you're only king for 5 years, 6 years, and you have a succession of kings, it tends to lead to more infighting amongst the nobility. So Martin V, correspondingly, also has a long reign. He's pope for 14 years, which for a pope is pretty good. You tended to get elected older than some kings might. But over this 14-year time period, Martin himself is a fairly even-handed pope, and so he really brings a lot of people who are suspicious of the papacy at all back to the fold. He represents some form of stability. He acknowledges the power of councils. He sort of tips his hat to the conciliar movement that helped to form him, or helped to bring him to be pope. And this really helps end the crisis. Now, conciliarism itself doesn't go away. There's this continued demand that perhaps popes should be governed over by councils and that there should be regular ecumenical councils to check the power of the pope. And we might see this as something like the nobility's demands in the Magna Carta or the French Estate General or the Spanish Cortes, right? These groups that are forming to ostensibly offer guidance, but also in some sense to check the power of central kings, and in this case popes, and create some form of stability for the organization. Some of the readings that are online, John of Paris articulates this, Marsilio of Padua, who I mentioned, and their articulation really is about stability, not needing to trust in one person, and checking the power of individuals who can at times act erratically. Now, Conciliarism doesn't go as far as the courts do in Europe. The courts don't ever disappear, although there's a long time when the French courts aren't called, but Spanish, German, English, that continues to be a feature of European political life. But the conciliar movement, by the time we get to Pope Pius II, who is about 40 years after the Council of Constance, he issues the papal bull Execrabilis, which condemns the idea of the councils having power over popes, and it really reinforces the fact that the pope is the single head of the church. So, 40 years after, memory of the event has probably faded. There are fewer people around who say, no, actually, that was really bad, and we need councils. We need that capacity to maintain the stability of the organization. The papacy is beginning to look a little more stable at this point. So the prime position and general overall power of the Pope gets reinforced. So conciliarism is not a permanent thing, but it is a real feature and echoes something both about the political life, but also about how the church sees itself resolving crises like these. That obviously could happen again. Now, it turns out it hasn't, but it is a possibility in the way that things are done with the election of the College of Cardinals, etc. Now, one of the other things to come out of this Great Schism and the problems that it causes for Christianity in general are some sets of thinkers who will become important in the Reformation. The two that I'm singling out here, John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, some of their ideas come directly out of their responses to the Great Schism and to the Conciliarism movement. And they are both influential people. Martin Luther, in particular, has clearly read John Wycliffe. There's a letter of Martin Luther's online that you can see some of his ideas relate back to Wycliffite ideals. Now, Wycliffe and Hus both go further than that. They have other theological ideas that get mixed up in it, but part of their boldness in what they propose is because of the real disastrous state of the papacy and all of the problems that shake out of that for Christianity in general, for European Catholicism in general. So, like a lot of people around Wycliffe, this is a common view, he has a respect for the office of pope. He thinks that having a pope is basically a good idea, but he has a real hatred of what it has become and the people who are holding it in his lifetime. I mentioned earlier that he refers to it, he's in Parliament, he refers to Avignon as that sinful city or the nest of simony. He really has no love of anybody being pope at that time. And this is a tone that you really see reflected in Martin Luther. He says, well, sure, the Bishop of Rome is important, but the person holding the office of the Bishop of Rome is horrible, and so I don't necessarily owe them allegiance. Wycliffe was a student and eventually a professor at Oxford. He studied with the great theologian William of Ockham's razor fame. That was originally a Catholic precept, although it's not usually portrayed that way in modern pop culture. It's notable that Occam himself is one of the early formulators of conciliarism. In Occam's formulation, he describes the church not as a church of clerics and leaders, but as a collection of the faithful, so de-emphasizing the hierarchy and emphasizing the believers. Now, it's worth noting that Occam himself had a run-in with one of the Avignon popes, so he also, as the teacher of Wycliffe, has no love for that institution. He's a run-in with Pope John the 22nd. John the 22nd is having a fight about the apostolic poverty and the rule of St. Francis, and Occam defends the Franciscans against John the 22nd. John the 22nd has him brought to Avignon, and John the 22nd has him brought to Avignon and questioned, and eventually Occam actually leaves without permission. He just gets up and goes back to England. And for that, he is briefly excommunicated for apostasy, although they don't actually condemn any specifics of his works, and he's not burned or executed or anything. And actually, Innocent VI in 1359 has that sentence commuted after his death, but he is today he is considered one of the writers of the medieval church. He didn't die in disgrace, so not like his student Wycliffe, but you can see some of the tensions already in Occam's life and where some of Wycliffe's ideas come from. Now, Wycliffe is as I said, a professor at Oxford. In 1383, he comes out with a Bible translation, and that is what you were looking at here. If you can read it, I think the one on the left is a little bit easier to read, but if you look close, you can see the first few words there. It's in Middle English, but you can get a sense of it. The Lord forsoya clepids Moses, and spake to him fro the tabernacle of witnessing, saying, speak to the sons of Israel. And it goes on like that. But you can see the Lord forsoya clepids Moses, and spake to him. I think there's a little thorn used in Middle English, and tabernacle of witnessing. Witnessing is one of the harder ones to make out, starting at the end of the second line with the W-I-T and then nessing over the course of the beginning of the next one. Anyway, this is Wycliffe's translation. We still have copies of it, obviously. But this was also a big deal to have it translated, and he is one of the first people to say, well, no, it should be available in the vernacular. This is obviously something that Luther is going to pick up on. And one of the things that gets Wycliffe in trouble, it's not the only thing. And there are other Bibles in the vernacular. Wycliffe is one of the first real proponents of that, which is notable. But it's not the one thing that he gets condemned for. He's eventually executed. He's beheaded on December 31st, 1384. Here he is at his trial, and you'll notice after he's executed, he's later exhumed and burned. They want to make good and sure that he's dead. And, those sorts of things happen sometimes. Anyway, one of the other things that gets him in trouble, relating back to the Great Schism, he claims that the church should be poor and should not deal in politics. One of the things he writes particularly against is the increasing number of indulgences, and this becomes very important for Martin Luther. This is one of the chief things that Martin Luther rails against the church. Wycliffe feels that indulgences are a form of simony. That's one of the things that he accuses Avignon of, that the number of indulgences increases. And as an interesting fact, it's worth noting that once the printing press is invented in the middle of the 15th century, one of the most printed things in the 15th century are indulgences that are given to people. It becomes this way to buy your way out of sin, and that's certainly what Martin Luther condemns it as, that if you have the money, you can go, you buy an indulgence, you say, I did such and such sin, you pay for it, you're given this slip of paper, you read it, hang it on your wall, keep it with you, and it's a way of buying off sins that you feel you've committed. Now, originally, these indulgences were given to crusaders. We talked about this a little bit with the crusading movement as a way of absolving sins of people who were about to go on pilgrimage, be it violent pilgrimage or not. But it's really become a way for the church to make a lot of money at this point. They can sell indulgences. Some people buy lots and lots of them, and it's a real revenue source. And both Wycliffe and later Luther will really attack them for this. As I said, Wycliffe considers it a form of simony. But he also thinks that kings and secular authorities should have control over the church in their realm. So he's weighing in on the remnants of the investiture controversy. He thinks that the Pope really shouldn't have that much money, right? The church should live in poverty. And this is reminiscent of one of the solutions offered and not taken during the investiture controversy itself. In this way, he might have agreed, and that solution was offered by Ivo of Chartres, if you remember, under Gregory VII. And he might have agreed initially with Gregory VII on some of the reforms and what things wanted to do. But under the Avignon papacy, when these things have to do with the papacy being under the control of the French king and the political circumstances surrounding it, it strikes too close to home, and he comes across as far too strident. Not only is he executed in 1384, he is declared anathema again at the Council of Constance in 1415, and it's Pope Martin who has him exhumed and later burned. And so you can see, even in the resolution of the Great Schism, as I said, you may want to make sure he's really good and dead, but they're also going back and trying to tamp down these things that rose up during the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism. And of course, in retrospect, with Martin Luther and Martin Luther's influence from John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, we know that this isn't going to work. But at the time, it's part of this more systematic attempt to return the papacy to something like what it looked like in the 13th century. Now, the other person I'm going to mention, here he is, Jan Hus, along with Martin Luther. Martin Luther's sort of the shadow at the end of this story. I'm not going to talk a lot about Martin Luther because that really is part of the narrative of early modern history, the Reformation. That's a little beyond the scope of this class. But it's good to know that that's where this is pointing. Now, Jan Hus himself is executed 1415. He's burned at the stake, also declared anathema at the Council of Constance. You'll notice 1415, that's right in the middle of the council. So he also is mixed up exactly in this Great Schism difficulty. He actually, in some ways, gets a lot of his ideas from Wycliffe. Now, Jan Hus probably learned about Wycliffe when Henry II of England made a trip to Bohemia with a whole entourage of people from England. And Henry II goes to Bohemia to marry Anne of Bohemia in 1381, 1382. He's there for a while. And it's probably from that visit and import of English ideas into Bohemia that Jan Hus hears about some of the ideas of Wycliffe. Now, particularly Wycliffe is going to get executed 2 years later, so it's possible that Wycliffe is already causing something of a stir. And Jan Hus is particularly attracted by the ideas of the rule of secular rulers over the Pope, something of conciliarism, that councils should be the ultimate authority of the church. And in particular, he's very attracted to the idea of church poverty because the schism and its resulting chaos in finances has had a disastrous effect on the University of Prague, where Hus is himself a professor. And the mix-up of finances, right? Because the church raises tons of money and helps finance these universities. And when the Curia splits, that splits the whole financial system. It really looks like something like the American Civil War, right? When suddenly half the states, half the economy of a country just splits. And it's real chaos. And he feels that as a professor of the university. And he's very attracted by Wycliffe's proposed solution of sort of the poverty of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the separation of the finances of universities from the church itself. So he really is attracted to some of those ideas. And in fact, at Jan Hus's trial at the Council of Constance, they actually ask him specifically about Wycliffe, because of course Wycliffe has already been condemned and executed by that time. And he says, yeah, I was influenced by Wycliffe. I still like Wycliffe. He doesn't agree with all of the things, the theological points that Wycliffe got in trouble for, but even his continued support and statement of following of Wycliffe was one of the things that really got him in trouble at the council. Now, after their executions and after the Council of Constance, their followers don't disappear. The followers of Wycliffe in England are sometimes referred to as Lollards, but they continue, and there's some evidence that the Lollards continue to exist in the English Reformation, that there is this undertow in English society of people who are already interested in a Bible in the vernacular, already interested in not being directly under the thumb of Rome. Now, in Bohemia, this is even more radical. The followers of Jan Hus include a number of small nobles, certainly a lot of lower classes in the area who are not interested in following the papal hierarchy. And to some extent, Hus's trial and execution drives Bohemia further away from the Catholic Church. And there's actually a series of wars called the Hussite Wars, literally after the Hussites, the followers of Jan Hus. And Martin V, the same pope that has Wycliffe exhumed and burned after he had already been executed, declares in a papal bull that all followers of both Hus and Wycliffe may be slaughtered, and declares it a crusade, sends a crusade particularly into Bohemia. In England, as I said, their resistance is not as uniform and the followers are not as organized. But 3 crusades get sent into Bohemia, Czechoslovakia, and none of them succeed. There are sort of great stories of mounted knights riding in, and the Bohemians have a bunch of peasants on carts with pikes sticking out of carts. You have these little mobile pin cushions that the mounted knights don't do so well against. And particularly because of these crusades, it really cements Hussite following. And so when the Reformation comes along 100 years later, a huge percentage of Bohemia is essentially already not Catholic. They are Hussites of one form or another. Some other Reformation ideas, those of Martin Luther, do get adopted in places, but the Hussite rebellion and the Hussite Wars is really the moment, in some ways, is the beginning of the Reformation in Bohemia. We tend to pin it on Martin Luther because that's a much more widespread event, and it has this knock-on effect that produces Calvin and Zwingli and other major reformers all within a few decades. Hus stands out a little more alone, but you can already see in Hus, picking up from Wycliffe, overuse of indulgences, excessive papal authority, the non-poverty of the church, some of the big issues that Luther himself will hold up and prize as the items that make the Reformation what it is. So, just a brief recap, you see from the beginning of the 14th century, from 1300 to 1500, this long crisis in the church, starting with the fight between the Pope and the King of France, that eventually ends in the Pope getting slapped and dying, and then the papacy being moved to Avignon as the French king forces the election of a Frenchman. The continued presence of the papacy as basically something controlled by the French crown that angers more and more people in Christendom. You eventually get to a point where the Pope returns to Rome, dies too soon, problematic elections follow, the riots in Rome, and you get this schism that after the long Avignon papacy, at this point people have really had enough. And it's out of the schism that come ideas of Conciliarism, but also ideas like Wycliffe, right? It emboldens thinkers who are looking for ways out of the church. Well, that's not fair. They're not looking for ways out of the church. They are looking for ways to reform the church. The long crisis of the Avignon papacy and then the Great Schism emboldens all those people who are unhappy with the way that the church is being run. And certainly nobody is happy with the Great Schism, right? This sort of highlights for everybody how poorly the hierarchical system of the Catholic Church is functioning at that time. And so everybody is looking for a way out. And the way that it eventually is found with the Council of Constance and Martin V restores the papacy to something like it was before, but a lot of these new ideas about how a church of poverty, a church with less hierarchy, a church that is within a secular realm and is beholden to secular rulers rather than having one leader who is entirely outside of the secular hierarchy. All of these things are elements that come to play in the reformations of Martin Luther, Calvin, the English Reformation, right, where you see a church declared explicitly to be a national church and under a national government, a real removal of the papal hierarchy. All of these things are ideas that are in one way or another floated or emboldened by the crisis of the Great Schism and its aftermath. So next time, we will start in on the economy. We will go back to the beginning one more time, start with Rome. We'll discuss the economy of late Rome, and we will move back through the whole time looking at daily life, how people traded and made goods and grew crops and all of that. So, see you next time.